All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, folks. My name is Cami Sacco, and I am a climate programs manager with Second Nature. And today we're going to be talking about how to engage your faculty and staff in your climate action planning. So I'm going to go through a couple logistics, and then I'll hand it off to our speakers, Carter and Josh. So before we move into the content, just some logistics. Program is being recorded. We will post it to YouTube after. I will send it to all registrants. And we've also been sending it out in the implementer. And so those will be living on our YouTube channel if you're interested in sending those to colleagues. If you're feeling friendly, please say hello in the chat and where you're coming from. We'd love to know who's here in the quote unquote room. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to either put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I have the questions that some folks asked in the registration. So we'll be using those as a jumpstart into Q&A. And also you're welcome to add them at any time. So some of you may have been to some of the past webinars in this series, in the Climate Action Planning webinar series. And so we've talked about a lot of different things, from embedding equity to geothermal on campus, to how to choose how to write your climate action plan. And those, the 8 before this, are all up on YouTube if you're interested in those. And then the next 3 will be taking place in January, and more information about them can be found on the website here that you see on the screen. We also have our Higher Ed Climate Leadership Summit, which I'm sure many of you know about. Early bird registration ends next Wednesday, December 18th. So please, if you're interested, get that early bird rate before rates go up in January or late December if you're still going to be working. All right, so we have a couple working groups that we like to highlight at the beginning of these webinars, and the first one is the Intersectional Climate Action Leaders Working Group. This is led by our colleague Blythe for just a little bit longer, and if you're interested in this, this is a BIPOC affinity space for members and non-members of the Climate Leadership Network, and it's intended for HBCU, MSI, or also known as minority serving institutions, and tribal college climate action stakeholders, as well as community NGO and corporate partners. So if you're interested in that and part of that community, please go ahead and either scan the QR code, or you can contact Blythe with the email that you also see on the screen. The next one we have is our IRA Community of Practice, which kicked off a couple weeks ago by our fellow Theo Daniels. If you're interested in this, you're also welcome to scan the QR code. I believe, I don't remember the cadence of the meetings. I want to say monthly, but please, if you're interested, go ahead and join via the QR code, and somebody from our team, either Theo or Bridget, will reach out to you. All right, so with many and most of these webinars, we start off with a poll to just understand a little bit more about where you sit at within your institution. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and it's just pretty basic questions about, where your role is within the institutions, and this one specifically about how you've engaged your faculty and staff thus far. So I'll keep it open just for a couple minutes. Okay, it looks like folks have pretty much completed who are able. So I'm just gonna, you guys should be able to see this, but I'm gonna read it out loud. So we have quite a breadth of folks, which is great to see. Just one person from Student Affairs, shout out to Student Affairs, and one or three people from Academic Affairs that are doing sustainability work. Quite a few in facilities and operations. So 43% of y'all are within that division, and then a few from upper administration within sustainability, and then a couple in the other and non-university attendee category. Pretty, again, healthy mix of what institution type people are coming from. Shout out to our one large public institution and our one minority MSI and our one community college attendee. We're very happy that all of you guys are here. And then quite a few, 30% from small public institutions, about 50% from private institutions. That's interesting. And then a couple from non-university that are non-university attendees. How far along are you in completing your climate action plan? About 25 of you haven't started, but you're about to. One of you is just beginning. 4 of you are in the middle. 3 are close to completion, and then 3 have not started, not sure when or if you will. And then 25% or 5 of you are in the other category. And then also, how engaged is your faculty in your climate action planning process? Pretty good and healthy mix. 1 is not engaged at all. 5 is engaged on all levels. It seems like we have most people in the 2s and 3s for faculty, and then for staff, similarly in the 2s and 3s. So that is really interesting as well. So this is helpful, I think, for Carter and Josh to really understand who's here more specifically a little bit more. And the other thing that I want to note before I introduce Carter is if folks have other suggestions around how they have engaged faculty and staff that is not part of either of these presentations. We know that, 2 people don't hold all of the answers, right? So go ahead and put it in the chat if you do feel like you've had some things that have happened that you're like, this was really impactful and changed the way in the depth of the way that we engage faculty and staff. So I just wanted to say that before I introduce Carter. So our 2 speakers today are Carter Strickland and Joshua Radoff. And Carter is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Director of Climate Action at the State University of New York, also known as SUNY. It spans 64 campuses, including 3 teaching hospitals, and educates 1.3 million students. With over 30 years of experience across government, nonprofit, and private sectors, Carter has been a leader on developing strategic visions and implementing tangible solutions to environmental issues, and is a recognized subject matter expert in water, air, energy, natural climate solutions, climate risk assessment, and green business development, with a proven track record of driving organizational change, creating partnership policies, and building infrastructure. Previous posts include the Mid-Atlantic Regional VP and New York State Director for the Trust of Public Land, Commissioner for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, Advisor for Closed Loop Partners Organics Recycling Business, Policy Advisor to NYC Mayor Michael Bloomberg, a litigator and professor at the Rutgers Environmental Law Clinic, prosecutor with the Office of New York Attorney General, Environmental Protection Bureau, and a board member of the Land Trust Alliance of New York, the Billion Oyster Project, Natural Areas Conservancy, and Regional Plan Association. Carter teaches a graduate seminar on environmental infrastructure for sustainable cities at Columbia University. Thanks so much for being here, Carter, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Cami. That's a very generous reading of my bio, and just the takeaway maybe for this audience is that I'm a generalist and make connections like a lot of sustainability folks. So, Cami, if you can go to the next slide, please. And I will say that I'm very engaged. I'm very interested in this topic, and in part, I'm looking forward to the Q&A section that we're going to have at the end. Because I think we're sort of at the end of our plan engagement process, but I do think that um, what I hear from you in terms of other suggestions, we certainly will want to put in place for the ongoing implementation. Plans are fluid. We're at the tail end of our very fast engagement period, which you'll hear about. Um, and so I'm looking forward to learning as much as saying what we're up to. So SUNY, yeah, very briefly, you heard 64 schools. I sit at the system level, um, and you can see, the geographic scale across New York State of our schools. We're a little bit unique in that, unlike the California system, for example, which has three separate systems, we're combined together. So we have 30 community colleges, a number of what we call technical schools, which are generally outgrowths of historic agricultural technical schools, university colleges, which are comprehensive colleges, which many of whom are an outgrowth of historic teachers colleges. And then we have our university centers, and from R1s to other doctoral degree granting institutions. Um, a focus of this um, discussion today is not on students, but I'll note we have kind of a 3-to-1 ratio of students enrolled in credit programs and non-credit students who are registered. That reflects a lot of our training programs and workforce development programs, particularly at community colleges. Um, but more to the point of today's discussion, we have 85,000 faculty and staff. Again, about a 2-to-1 ratio, 30,000 roughly faculty and about 50,000 staff. Next slide, please. So just to give a sense of, we heard about the scale of facilities, but just drilling down for those of you paying, who grapple with energy and sustainability related issues. We do have the largest collection of state-owned buildings. So in addition to being an institution of higher education, we are a state agency. And that's important because we have a few drivers. One is the 2019 law called, we call it CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which adopts certain standards, 40% reduction compared to 1990 levels of greenhouse gases by 2030, 85% reduction by 2050, a number of other sustainability goals that are embedded in an executive order that applies to us. So that's one of the drivers, but certainly not the only driver. We do have a big energy spend. We spend somewhere between, fluctuates by energy price, but last full year we spent 214 million on energy. Over the years we've developed renewable energy projects, many of which are solar, currently representing about 3% of our energy use. We've long had geothermal heating and cooling. 16 of our campuses have that already. At least one has had it for 20 plus years. The next move we're going to make is to network those together in thermal energy systems. So that's rolling out at all of our campuses. Number of clean buildings, and so the result of that has been a reduction in energy use in the built environment. We use, for a variety of measuring reasons, we use 2015, so that's 13% reduction. But if you go back to 1990, looking at our scope 1 and 2, we've had a 36% reduction. Um, uh, Many of our schools have been tracking scope 1, 2, and portion of 3 for much longer, and have pretty impressive results. So you can all check that out on SciMap. Next slide, please. So yeah, shout out to the campus energy folks. I came in just a year and a half ago. There really was no sustainability presence, or a very limited one at the system level before then, but a pretty robust but uneven presence at the schools. But we're sort of not starting from scratch. There's a lot of efforts by our sustainability staff, in our building sector, in terms of green infrastructure on grounds, transportation, working with students, and rolling out things like the sustainability development goals from the UN into our classroom. So there's a long history of that. Next slide, please. And it's reflected in many of the third-party recognitions for our campuses. Um, Shout out to Second Nature. We have a number of campuses that jumped on those um, carbon neutrality and resilience goals early on. We also have a number of schools that are part of the STARS rating system, and I'm certainly encouraging more schools and incentivizing them to join that. Um, you know, One of the interesting things for me is paying attention to our hospital sector, which is a little bit different, or teaching hospitals. There's another rating system called Practice Green Health there. So, that's been terrific, and certainly we've had a lot of action. Next slide, please. And I say that because that's really the staff level. So the focus of today's discussion is faculty and staff. The staff have been involved in sustainability, and that's sort of a scope of work that I inherited for 20 plus years. So that's a very strong foundation, and certainly that institutional knowledge we were going to continue as we roll up. Our chancellor, when he came on board a little over 2 years ago, adopted sustainability as one of his organizing principles for our system, which is terrific, and charged us with developing a climate sustainability action plan, among many other things. Next slide, please. So, to do that, we drew on that legacy of our faculty and staff involvement. We created something called the Sustainability Advisory Council to help develop and inform the plan, co-led by presidents. So I guess they're not falling in this category of faculty and staff, but that's very important. Of course, trustees, so we want buy-in at all level, but strong campus presence. We have 53 experts from around the system, and we left it up to the presidents actually to nominate folks to be part of this Sustainability Advisory Council, the campus presidents, that is. In our system, the chancellor is the head of the system. The presidents are the head of campuses. I know in the UC system, it's the reverse. So, that's how we structured it. And so campuses nominated certainly folks from administration, folks from provost, but a lot of the staff from the faculty, facilities and energy operational teams who have been working on this for a long time, a number of faculty as well. And so next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So here's our process. Sorry about the formatting here, which got a little, changed in the transition to Google Slides, but you get the point. So it's a pretty fast track, and we're all in a hurry. We've got 2030 deadlines are tomorrow effectively. And also we want to make sure we didn't miss our annual state legislative budget cycle. So we're pushing to get this adopted at a January 28th, 2025 board meeting. And so that is about less than a year and a half after our kickoff in November 2023. So our Sustainability Advisory Council met. We developed some working groups, and here I think it was interesting that rather than focus on the exclusively on the big greenhouse gas drivers of facilities, buildings, and operations, certainly part of our plan, but we wanted to carve out room for our core businesses in education, research, green workforce development, very roughly corresponding to our R1 research institutions, comprehensive colleges, and community colleges, and speak to that. So we had working groups that were created on education and research as one working group, and obviously that's very heavily staffed by almost exclusively by faculty. We had a buildings group almost exclusively staffed by or comprised of our staff. We had a working group on green workforce development, which is a little bit more of a grab bag. And another one was on student engagement. So those are our main sort of working groups going forward. We came up with an initial draft of the plan through a number of workshops. And so, and then, one of the things I wanted to highlight was a sustainability conference we had as a system. bringing together 80 plus largely staff from around the system to sort of fine tune it before we released it for internal comments. Then we had a board meeting in August, put it out for review in uh, September for roughly 3 months of review, and you'll hear more about that process later. So where we are now in red is next week, we're meeting, the Sustainability Advisory Council is meeting again to review it, and then we go to the Board of Trustees in January. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the Sustainability Advisory Board. This is our in-person workshop. Because we're so spread out, we did a lot online, but this was a all-day session, where we met, and that really helped us hammer out the work we were doing. Next slide, please. I should say also our working groups, I misspoke. Our working groups, the 4 working groups were education and research, green workforce development, buildings, and then we did split out operations, which is a broad group covering everything. So here, just some examples from the sustainability conference we had in June, and again, this was a day-and-a-half conference where we hammered out a lot of details and sort of elevated many of the case studies from our campus. So our approach is to level up based on those great case studies. Next slide, please. So here's the general outline of the plan. This largely won't change. It's still available at this site if you want to check it out. But we've closed the comment period. The overall structure, as I mentioned, was to split it up into 7 strategic action areas that speak to our overall commitment to greenhouse gas reduction and governance, education, research, green workforce development, then into the sort of big capital items of clean energy, sustainable operations, and inclusive engagement. Next slide, please. So, post-draft engagement, what have we been up to for the last 3 months? We met with a lot of our affinity groups. A major one, of course, big stakeholder on campus and our shared governance model. It's true across the sector. Is our faculty. We addressed one of our board members who was part of the Sustainability Advisory Council, also wears another hat, which is head of the Faculty Senate and a faculty member and representative to our Board of Trustees. So he was a key player and facilitated our presentation to the Faculty Senate. We got great comments there. We also addressed a number of faculty affinity groups. For example, there's a community of practice among faculty that teach international programs and related courses. We spoke to that group. They had an all-day meeting. So as much as possible, we got on agendas of standing meetings, and that was really, really helpful in terms of getting comments. In terms of staff, there are a number of affiliate groups that are actually quite strong, particularly because our system is so spread out. For example, we have actually 501c3, so standalone organizations for our SUNY business officers, for our community college business officers. These are folks who might be VPs of administration and finance on your campuses, also known as the key decision makers. We certainly wanted them on board, and they have biannual conferences. We are able to jump on those and get their comments. Similarly, there's a group of folks from largely the facility group called the Physical Plant Administrators. They have a standalone organization, and we were able to jump on those conferences and made a lot of campus visits. Not a majority of the campuses, but we did get out to 18 representative campuses. And I will say that a number of those have very strong faculty presence, and all of them have very strong staff presence. So there's a number of campuses like New Paltz, for example, it's a school of about 7,000 students, but they have sustainability community of practice among all different departments of 70 members. So they're quite strong. They get a small stipend to be part of that and to undertake various duties, but they certainly had a very strong voice. There's some other schools where rather than a staff sustainability lead on the campus, um, uh, they have a faculty-led organization, Binghamton, FIT, Old Westbury, Brockport, Buffalo State, I would mention. And so we met with those campuses and those groups were helpful. We certainly sort of checked the box on a number of other internal stakeholders addressing, as I mentioned, the Board of Trustees, the presidents get together on occasion, student assembly, which I know was the topic of last week's or last month's discussion, and other affiliates, including our auxiliary group, to get them on board with the plan. So next slide, please. I know I only have a few minutes left, so let's see. Here's an example of our program at New Paltz. This was a 3-hour session, engagement section. You can see some of the breakout groups. Obviously, heavy representation by students. It's a very activist campus. The table in the back, though, is mostly faculty. So these were tables that were organized according to the structure of our plan, and then people would move around. And we gathered a lot of great ideas here. I wanted to highlight New Paltz in particular because it has a very strong faculty community practice, as I mentioned. It's also an historic and current teachers college. And they actually have drafted, I think it's not out in press yet, but a book on incorporating sustainability into curriculum from K through 12 and beyond. So that was obviously some expertise we wanted to tap into. Next slide, please. And just so you know, I'm not going to read these because we're out of time, and these are focused on the substance of our plan rather than the process of including people. But I think you can see, because we structured education the way we did, and some of these goals and actions, the goals will change, maybe not the actions, just to become a little sharper, but we had to involve faculty. Next slide, please. And you can see the other research. Obviously, we had to involve faculty, and we already do a lot, and certainly they're going to have a strong involvement there. Next slide, please. So you're going to get a copy of these slides, from Cami, but just to give you a sense of what we're doing. Green workforce development, this is really, again, very much in the purview of our community college staff who work on these programs, are structured to listen to industry about what's needed, and then help meet those training goals. Next slide, please. Buildings and energy, we have a great cohort of energy managers who are our staff and facilities groups, and they've been on this for a while, but it's a big effort, and we certainly have a lot of external resources we're bringing to bear, but the key linchpin is our internal staff stakeholders. Next slide, please. Operations, same thing, and then the last one I think is, inclusive engagement, which really the key organizer at the campus level are the student groups, but those student groups really depend on mentorship from our sustainability professionals who are staff. So I think that's all I have, Cami, for now. Great.
Great. Thank you, Carter. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Joshua. So Joshua Radoff is the renewable and sustainable energy specialization lead within the Masters of the Environment program at CU Boulder, which is Colorado University Boulder, where he teaches classes on sustainability and decarbonization, and served on the Climate Action Planning Steering Committee, and now serves on the Campus Sustainability Executive Committee. He also works with the NGO ICLEI as a Zero Carbon Cities advisor and as an independent consultant on various district-scale sustainable development projects with a focus on climate action planning, facility electrification, and distributed energy and grid interactivity. So Josh, I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Thanks, Cami. Hi, everybody. Good to be with you all. I'm going to talk about CU Boulder's climate action planning process, which took place over the last year and a half or so, and was released this last April to much fanfare. It was a pretty big deal on campus. And as you sort of got from the Cammie's intro, I didn't mention this, but I've only been on campus for the last 4 years, so a lot of the whole campus politics dynamics were new to me, and it was really interesting to kind of get to know it through the process of the climate action plan. So I'll talk about this. As you heard, you could probably tell from my bio, I'm into the kind of technical aspects of decarbonization and the process of decarbonization, but I am not here presenting to you as an expert on engagement. I haven't met really that many amazing experts on engagement out there. I get the sense that people kind of make it up as they go and try to figure out what works for them. So this might be, as much as anything else, a group therapy session. If you all have things to sort of add to it, as much as a source of wisdom. But I think at least I sort of got a lot out of what we did well because we were well intentioned, but also what we sort of stumbled through, and then what we tried to fix, and I think what got better the second time around. So here you see the overall timeline, mostly just to sort of say this has been going on for a year and a half. We issued a few sort of drafts that were public. We hosted sort of big town halls as part of our engagement strategy, but I'll talk more about that specifically as we go. Next slide, please. First of all, and I think this is important from the engagement perspective, the steering committee, of which you'll see my name on here, was a mix of faculty, staff, and students. And this actually, I think, well, it was challenging in some cases because we had different perspectives on things, but you'll notice on the staff side, we had really key involvement from the campus CFO, Todd Haggerty in this case, and Chris Wright involved in finance. So when we were coming up with, multi-hundreds of million dollar projects, it was good to have these people on board to kind of help guide the process. It was also really great to have the students who were listed on here, in part because, one of these represented more of the activist community on campus, I would say. And again, sort of brought perspectives that the rest of us didn't really want to talk about, like divestment. And it, I think, was important to sort of head off issues that eventually did come up. And I'm kind of glad we had their perspective on there as well. So I think this was part of our initial success, or something that led to our eventual success. Next slide, please. Just to say, what was the climate action plan? Again, Carter was just talking about a system-wide approach. This is a campus, we're a big campus. We're the flagship campus for the University of Colorado system, but again, just still a campus. And this climate action plan was really focused on emissions reductions. I don't know that this was a stated principle, but I would say that in order to sort of have credibility to do other climate action planning things, we needed to understand how our own house was in order. And this was a lot of like what the genesis of this climate action plan was about to say, how are we reducing greenhouse gas emissions and getting to zero over time? So the main goal was to, first of all, for the first time in campus history, take on all scopes of emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, and to align those reductions with the Science-Based Target Initiative. So we have short-term goals of 50%, long-term goals of 0. And we did so without the use of RECs and offsets, which is pretty controversial. But really, we felt like this was a way, from an engagement perspective, to sort of take out of the discussion this sort of haggling about what % reduction is appropriate. The science-based targets sort of give you the sense to say, it doesn't matter what we think the right reductions are. The Paris Agreement and the Earth needs a certain level of reductions to get to 1.5 C, whether you agree with that or not, and we're just going to sort of all get on the same page with that. And that was a really important early phase decision we made, and it made our engagement, I would say, a lot easier down the road. We also wanted to sort of not have blinders on when it came to emissions reductions, so we were really looking for maximizing co-benefits, which we called them, of equity, health, and resilience. And we also wanted to use this to sort of build up engagement and communication with the rest of campus, because we were essentially starting this process with a campus, I think, that felt very disengaged, very disenfranchised from sustainability and what campus was doing about it. And so this was a chance to build trust and essentially rebuild a relationship, which I think we did so as part of this. Next slide, please. So here are the results, and I won't sort of get too far into it, but a big part of the engagement strategy was around communicating data. I'll show you later, we've been building a dashboard that we can update on a regular basis. But I think giving this data in particular on this slide, the scopes 1 through 3 emissions and the different relevant categories within scope 3 to campus and use this as a way to sort of like, as a basis for our engagement, meant that we weren't like randomly talking about the issues that one person thought was important. We could sort of focus on, there's a few clear places where we need to address. Within scope 3, which I'll get to in a second, I think there's an additional nuance there about not only where are there big emissions pieces, but also where we can have the most impact. But again, a big part of our engagement was around data. And so this slide was probably the most important one. Next slide, please. The other thing that we did with engagement, again, around the early phases, was to kind of let campus see the different scenarios that we were evaluating and kicking around. So these represent a few different scenarios, but what you can see eventually, or where you could see in the red was what we eventually adopted as our recommended scenario. And the dashed line was the science-based target line. And again, like the beauty of a science-based target is it's not just a point in the distant future. It really represents a year-over-year goal, right? And so we might hit our goal in 2030, but if we're not sort of positioned to hit it in 2035, we're not meeting the goal. It also means we're not waiting to take action until 2040 or 2050. So again, establishing science-based target as the core of our approach, and then showing that we had a sequenced approach of activities to do that sort of kept us beneath that dash line, which is the red line, was again a key part of building trust and communicating that we were on track for the main thing that we needed to achieve. Next slide, please. We also, had to do a lot of just education around what the scopes of emissions were and what the different categories of scope 3 are. I mean, this is the realm of, specialist consultants who know all of this. We have a lot of students who are super interested in this. And, one student group has created a class now on scope 3 accounting, which is really great. And they're using our data. And it took a while for us to get to the point where we were comfortable sharing with everybody. But this first question about like what's relevant for us and what isn't as a university was a really interesting internal conversation that we had. And you can see here about just the things that are in, the things that are out. So we wanted to be able to say, look, if something's an NA for us, we need to be able to explain why that is. If something's in our inventory but not a target, we need to be able to explain why that might be, right? Because we saw the inclusion of scope 3 as really an evolution, as something that was going to take place over time. And that was, some people got it, and for others it took a little more dialogue. So that was a big part of our engagement, was just helping people understand scope 3 and why we were sort of approaching it the way we were going to. Next slide, please. A big part of what people cared about, I got to say, like people, it was hard to engage people on scopes 1 and 2. Getting people excited about the building efficiency or heat recovery that you were going to do in your buildings, or the electrification of buildings, was of interest and was the main sort of theme of the reduction strategy. But where people, I think it got really personal for people, was in the scope 3 list. So this is the essentially high priority list that we came up with to prioritize, that really address those sort of scope 3 measures. And you can see why this type of thing would be, really engaging for people. Embodied carbon, maybe, or maybe not. That's really about like the nature of the buildings themselves. But all the things around transportation and procurement, what do we buy? How are we getting to school? What does our waste strategy look like? What are we ordering? What kind of food are we interacting with? All that becomes very personal. And so our scope 3, the inclusion of it, was a really, really important piece, not only of our overall cap, but also of the engagement strategy. It made the engagement much more interesting. When we get to the roadshow in a second, some of the people we wanted to see, some groups on campus were just like, just come and only tell us about the scope 3 list. That's all we care about, which is, I found really surprising. Anyway, next slide. As I mentioned, this is a draft of our dashboard. It's not live yet. We only just finished this a few months ago, and so we're making sure the data looks right so that we can publish this. But the idea is to sort of create a lot of interactive data that, again, if we want to build trust with people, we need to let them sort of unpack all this data themselves, not just sort of tell them that we've got it covered. So that's what the intent is here. And again, we have all the scopes here. If you, when it's live, you'll be able to click through and sort of see the sort of detailed energy use and emissions and how emissions are either aligned or not aligned with our plan over time. A lot of engagement comes down to accountability, or we learned came down to accountability and trust. And so we felt like unless we could sort of say in a year-over-year basis how we were doing, not just in terms of our data, but in terms of activating the various projects that we said we were going to do, then we weren't going to have a lot of accountability. So that was important. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about engagement, and this is just a stock photo of an empty auditorium that I threw on there. But that's exactly what our first sort of big town hall looked like, where we were all really excited for hundreds of people on campus to come because we're Boulder and we felt people were going to be really engaged in climate, and no one came. Or we had a handful of people come, and it was pretty disappointing. And so we had to eventually sort of go from hosting these kind of centralized events where we thought people would come to us, to a different approach where we sort of organized a roadshow and took it to them. We were doing sort of online feedback, which was fine, but we weren't getting enough. As I said, we started this draft dashboard, but mostly what we got was a lot of unsolicited criticism about why the climate action plan was already broken, even though we hadn't even started it yet, which I found really curious and frustrating. As an example, next slide, please. You know, there were like petitions circulating, and this is like while we were in draft form, and the things that people were upset about were the things that we were planning to do. So there was a real disconnect, clearly, between what either the trust that people had that the campus would get it right, or trust in the process itself, or just the communication in the fact that we had already decided to do certain things, but campus was really sort of upset about, or various people on campus were upset about the fact that certain things weren't happening. So clearly things weren't going well, or at least not as well as they might have been. So we made a real explicit decision to shift gears. Next slide, please. And so here is the kind of phase 2 of it. And the phase 2 is a lot of like, make a roadshow. And you'll see we probably went and visited with 20, 25 different groups on campus, and went to them when it was convenient for them. We asked them what they wanted to discuss. You know, we had our stock presentation, but if someone wanted to talk about scope 3, we could talk about scope 3. If someone wanted to talk about something else, we talked about whatever they wanted to. We also, there's this really interesting thing I learned about engagement, I would say, which is that if we went in and said, like, what do you think the climate action plan should be? Then we just got things that were all over the map. You know, some people wanted to talk about curriculum, some people wanted to talk about landscaping and general sustainability or waste management. So we kind of shifted to saying, like, we wanted to sort of primarily inform people about what we were doing, and then sort of target the questions about, you know, within a given context, where people sort of saw room for opportunity, or, you know, what they thought within that. So less open-ended was really helpful. We also, I think, originally ran into trouble because climate action plan can mean a lot of different things. As Carter was mentioning earlier, you know, for some people or universities, it's about, you know, everything. It's about research, it's about curriculum. For us, it was about operations and emissions reduction. And we hoped that that would set the foundation for those other conversations. But in some cases, people were clearly frustrated that they thought the scope should be about more than it was, and we needed to sort of explain how this scope fit into everything else. We did some peer reviews, you know, with groups like Colorado State, with other kind of big Western schools to understand where everyone was. Everyone sort of thought we should be like Stanford right off the bat, and that's not where we were. And so it was really helpful to contextualize things with peers and sort of say, this is where our plan would stack and meet within all that. I think that was helpful. A lot of the other stuff was, as I mentioned before, we continue to do online feedback, but giving students the data and giving the community the data was like a big piece of it. And then one of the main bits of feedback we got was that the climate action plan needed to have a governance aspect, and they needed to, and it needed to include students. Students needed to be part of the of how governance and management takes place, and we took that into account. And you'll see in a second. So next slide, please. This is a list of our roadshow. You won't know all the acronyms. I don't know all the acronyms. You'll see that it included on February 21st, meetings externally with the city, but most of this was internally with things like the business school, the law school, the research institute, the Boulder faculty assembly, arts and sciences, maybe the groups you'd expect, College of Music, whoever wanted a roadshow. We reached out to people that we knew were vocal, but whoever wanted one, we would go and meet with. The agenda for these was mostly like, we want to let you know what we're doing, because we think this science-based target approach with all scopes of emissions is going to kind of allay your worst fears about the university greenwashing or the university sort of not taking this seriously. And that worked. Most of these that I presented, the response was like, that's great. Thanks so much for coming here. And then they had lots of good questions, which we're able to answer. But it wasn't sort of a free-for-all of sort of ideas that were off topic or those types of things. And again, in some cases, the agenda was, I forget which group it was, they were like, just come talk to us about Scope 3 emissions and what we can do about Scope 3 emissions. And that was like the agenda there. So pretty simple from an agenda perspective on these roadshows. Next slide, please. And then lastly, one of the results of this process was the development of a campus sort of executive team to help move the climate action plan forward, right? So the climate action plan can just be a document, and that would be kind of a shame if it just stayed as a document. So we really wanted a government structure to move this forward. So this is a list of campus leadership. I was asked to sort of be on this as a continuation of the work, but you'll also see there's two students that are on here that have been really great vocal members of that. So when issues come up, we hear from everyone, and the students often have a really, again, unique perspective to add to that to that conversation. Okay, next slide, and that's my last slide. So again, I think I wanted to share a little bit about like what that experience looked like, what worked well, what was, what we sort of shifted midway through. Ultimately our campus, has just onboarded, since the Climate Action Plan launched, a new chancellor. The chancellor, like what Carter mentioned, is all about sustainability as his sort of like primary issue, both around research, academics, and curriculum, and operations. And so this climate action plan now is in, I think, really good hands on campus, where we have a campus that's clearly sort of prioritizing this, and the governance structure is in place to sort of hit the ground running. But it wasn't beforehand. And I think this transition and everything sort of we did through it, and the sort of like, discomfort and headaches and, everything we grappled with, was a really important process in a way to sort of, again, more than anything else, build trust on campus, and give ourselves like a roadmap on a number of levels going forward. So again, in the end, I think it was a really great experience, even though it was uncomfortable most of the way through it. So thank you all.
Thanks, Josh. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Carter, if you want to come on camera. Both of those are really helpful from the overarching view of systems level, and then more of the campus view. So I'm going to start with one question that we had from registration, and then we actually have 3 questions in the chat. And the first one might be a tough one, but essentially, how have you, so the question, the direct question is, how have you used leadership committees and also more grassroots faculty and staff working groups to work together? And that could be a similar question, you know, if like you have kind of like you said, Josh, you have these student activist groups that were saying that you weren't doing enough, but then you are about to do it. How do you, and so maybe from all that, from like the faculty and staff perspective, how do you kind of meet folks in the middle?
I can take that on just initially, and I'll use this opportunity also to um, say something that I put in the chat, but I guess if it's a recorded webinar, not everybody will see it, which is that as CU Boulder did, you know, wisely, SUNY also had at that link on one of the slides for the plan itself, it also links to a feedback form. So we provided an asynchronous um, way for the larger community, including, you know, faculty and staff, many of whom, but also we had outside groups provide comments. And so that we had the in-person roadshows, focus groups, and that asynchronous opportunity. And I think that addresses the question to a degree, Cami, which is that we provided a mechanism for outside groups to participate. Many did, which was great. I will say that the structure we had with a formal sustainability advisory council and then meeting through, you know, having roadshows, to use Josh's terminology, and town halls on campuses that were kind of open. We used existing sustainability teams on staff to help organize those, but they were open largely to the overall community, and so people could come in.
Maybe just one point on that, Kenny, is that, you know, and I'll just, I guess, tell a story. You know, one of the students on our climate action planning committee had also been a member of a group on campus called Fossil Free CU. And they were like a very loud voice, and their, you know, motto was like decarbonize now, right? And, you know, I think once you sort of take someone out of the position of activism and sort of make them part of the team that's sort of working on it with an equal voice, and they understand that now is obviously not physically possible, right? There's a ton of, you know, fundraising, financing, engineering, planning that needs to be done, that you understand that the realistic time frame on these, you know, is 5 to 15 years for many of these things, even though there's a lot of actions you can do now. You know, I think I mean, you know, she was always an ally, and she was always someone who was really sort of like ready to essentially work. But I think, you know, helping people be in a position of like, be on a working group where we're all sort of tasked with something, and they no longer have the luxury just to essentially say, you know, hold a placard and say, we want this. I don't know. I really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed, you know, having people with different perspectives working together, again, sometimes uncomfortably, because I think it led to a better outcome.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so we have a couple, I'm gonna ask two in the chat and then we'll see where we're almost at time. So so Yancey asks, and so I'll give one to you, Carter, and then I'll give one to you, Josh, within the same breath. So Carter, at the system level for SUNY, is the plan approach to build standard goals across campuses or tailor objectives to individual campuses' strengths and opportunities? And then for you, Josh, when you did the roadshow, who was speaking? Was it just you, or did you take a diverse team with you? So we'll start with Josh for this one, and then I'll hand it off to you, Carter.
Okay, so I would say there was usually someone from the steering committee, and there was that was my first slide. So if someone was interested in equity related topics, I didn't show this, but we had an equity subcommittee. So we would have somebody from the equity subcommittee take the lead on that. I took the lead on some, but I always went with someone like Heidi Van Genderen, our chief sustainability officer, or Chris Ewing, who leads infrastructure for us, would lead others. So, you know, again, there was 25 of those. We probably split those up. You know, there was, you know, divided by 6, and there was someone leading from each one. And we tried to sort of tailor who was there based on what the interest was.
Yeah, so my question is, you know, at the system level, is the plan approach to build standard goals or tailor objectives? The answer is both. We do want, you know, there's a floor for certain goals, but we have schools who are in very different uh, resource and other contexts. And in particular, the big dividing line in our system is between state-operated campuses, which do have to meet state goals, and that's everything from, you know, climate to waste to, you know, transitioning over our fleet to zero emission vehicles, things like that. You know, so that's pretty clear objectives and data streams and the like. Then we have community colleges, and they really are owned and operated by counties. And so SUNY is a programmatic and funding partner there, and we certainly want to elevate them, but there's only so much we can tell them to do. So, and they're more resource constrained given the student population they serve. So we're trying to create a certain floor and an overall direction while also recognizing that our levers are a little bit different for each school.
Thanks, Carter. And then we'll just end it quickly with another question from UNC, and then we'll close this out. What amount of full-time employee time and or consultant resources have been associated with the planning process in your experience? It's a big question.
I can, one thing that's easy so far for us is that no consultant resources in the plan formulation. However, plan implementation, where, we call out for a resilient study across our system to see what our exposure is to climate, vulnerability is to climate risk. That's going to be a consultant effort. We're going to have to fundraise for that. And, certainly implementation of our clean energy master plans, design, construction is going to be, through consultants. FTE was pretty substantial, so we have in the central system, we have 3 FTE. I would say 100% of my time, 50% of my colleagues' time, and so that's 2 FTE at the system level, plus I'm going to guesstimate, between all the campus folks who have been working on this and our Sustainability Advisory Council, another 10 FTE, probably 0.1 to 0.2% of a bunch of people.
It'll end by saying we did it in reverse. We used a consultant for the climate action plan itself, a company called Blue Strike, who we really leaned on to do the scopes 1 through 3 accounting, which is really helpful. And then the sort of like what I call techno-economic analysis, they had an engineering firm sub to them. And because we really wanted, I thought to do an effective climate action plan, to really understand the costs and benefits of all the sort of different measures, whether it's EV buses or, electrifying the central plants or whatever it was. So we wanted to have numbers for all that. And so they really provided a lot of that. And now that we have it, we've been sort of doing most of the implementation on ourselves. And yeah, it seemed like a lot of FTE time internally. I can't even begin to estimate how much, but this is also just an extension of people's jobs anyway. So a lot of the people that were engaged were already doing a variation of this work. I think some of it got repurposed and made more explicit. So it's hard to say exactly.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time. I think there's a lot given to folks, and I know I learned a little bit, and I think the 2 biggest things is go to where people are at and building trust. Those are the 2 main things to engage people on a level that feels adequate for involvement in the plan overall. So, all right. Well, we again appreciate everyone being here, and I will be sharing the link to the recording as well as the slide deck, and Josh and Carter's email will also be included in that. So we hope everyone has a good rest of the day and a great holiday as well. So we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.